Give yourself wholly to the work of the Lord. It is the Pastor's Heart. Dominic Steele here, and William Taylor is our guest. What is the work of the Lord? What is in vain if the resurrection is not true? The debate over eschatology and one's view of the new heavens and the new earth. Will there be a Sydney Harbour Bridge in the new creation? And in the meantime, what should be our priorities? William Taylor is the rector of St Helen's Church in London. He's engaged in ministry to city workers. He's written the book Revolutionary Work, addressing these issues. And he's been in Australia speaking at a series of conferences across the country in Western Australia, South Australia, Queensland, and in New South Wales. Mostly uni student conferences, although he's just been up at the Church Missionary Society conference in Mount Tamborine in Queensland. And we caught up with William just before Christmas about the woes of the Church of England. But after that discussion, we were having lunch and talking about the conferences that he'd been speaking at with uni students on 1 Corinthians 15 and the climax verse of that chapter. Because of the resurrection, give yourself wholly to the work of the Lord. William, I think it's your pastor's heart on this and your concern for us to get this view of work right, and all of that flowing out of your eschatology.
For sure. It's lovely to be back, Dominic. Most working people, certainly in London where I work, will spend 60% of their waking week, maybe 70% of their waking week in the workplace. And I think a lot of people kind of have a divide between what they do at home and what they do at work. And they know they've got to kind of live as a Christian. But the idea of doing the work of the Lord at work, i.e. speaking to people about Jesus and seeking to advance the gospel at work, is not necessarily at the front of their mind. And my understanding is that, we go to work to do our day's work, but we have a higher responsibility at work. And that changes, which is to make the Lord Jesus known. And I think that changes the whole way we see our 8 to 7 or 9 to 5 or 8 to 4 or whatever it happens to be.
There is a controversy, though, over what is the work of the Lord.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so you go to 1 Corinthians 15:58, and Paul says, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord. Now, I think in the context of the whole of 1 Corinthians, that has to be what you call gospel work, the proclamation of the gospel. And if you'd like, I'm happy to go through 1 Corinthians.
Give us the argument, yeah. I mean, you've just been speaking at it to the university students.
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, if you look at the work of the Lord in 1 Corinthians, you have, to start with, there in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, we are God's fellow workers, you are God's field, God's building. And he's talking about planting and watering, receiving wages according to the labour. You get exactly the same, and that's not just the Apostle Paul, because he then goes on to talk about each one who builds on the foundation.
I did this, Paul. Yeah,
and whether what you build will actually stand to the end. You get the same in chapter 9, and actually you get the same in chapter 15 when he says, I worked harder than any of them, and he's referring to himself apropos of the other apostles. And then really, I think really worth looking at is at the end in chapter 16, where he talks about the household of Stephanus, the first converts in Achaia. They have devoted themselves to the service of the saints, be subject to such as these, and to every fellow worker and labourer. And just earlier, chapter 16, verse 10, Timothy, he is doing the work of the Lord as I am. And a wide door for effective work has opened in chapter 16, verse 8. So every reference to the work of the Lord in 1 Corinthians is to gospel work, the teaching of the gospel, godly living, but the efforts to build the church, to advance the gospel, and so forth. And so I think you simply cannot, in the context of 1 Corinthians 15 and the whole of 1 Corinthians, suggest,
the thing you're supposed to give yourself to has to be the work of the Lord.
Yeah, and the work of the Lord is the Lord's work.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you've come across David Jackman, but he's a very well-known English Bible
I've heard him
teacher.
speak, yeah.
Well, I was speaking to him on the telephone actually about this series, And I said, some people think that the work of the Lord in 1 Corinthians 15:58 is just sort of anything I do. It's me being a good plumber or something like that. And
a barrister or a doctor or
a barrister, yeah.
Concert pianist
Yeah, that's right, or a garbage collector. And David just said, oh no, William, the work of the Lord is the Lord's work. And in the context of 1 Corinthians 15 and the whole of 1 Corinthians, I mean, that is so obvious. Actually, Peter Orr has written 2 very good articles on this, and I found them very helpful in my preparation.
And yet, Tim Keller and others have gone a completely different direction.
Yeah, I think it would be wrong to say they've gone a completely different direction. I mean, I have immense admiration for Tim. I've met him a number of times, and really, the work he has done he did across the world, we should be hugely grateful for. And certainly has had far more reach and influence than you and I ever will. So we're, just immensely grateful for Tim. I interacted with him because I'd read his book before I wrote Revolutionary Work, and this is the kind of mark of the man that he then wrote to me, and we had an interchange. We were both on our way to family weddings, actually. When we had this interchange, he sent me like 2 sides of A4, very carefully nuanced. And what I think has happened is those who have followed Tim have picked up his continuity between this creation and the next and run with it in a far less nuanced way. And you hear people following Tim, suggesting that, if I'm a great architect, I can do kind of resurrection architecture, that in some sense, in some way, something of that is going to come through into the new creation. And that's where the eschatology comes into it, because I don't think eschatologically you can, that has got a leg to stand on.
So you're saying there that's followers of Tim, not Tim himself saying that?
Well, I think what I want to say is Tim is much more nuanced than those who I've heard who take his line.
So what's he saying and what are you saying that's different?
I think the difference would be that he's got a much stronger continuity between this creation and the next.
Than you do?
Than I think the Bible does. And I mean, technically he follows a much more neo-Calvinist line, Doyerwerde and Abraham Kuypers and so forth, that there's going to be... Now, Jesus talks about a renewal of all things in chapter 19, but there is also very clearly a destruction of this creation and things, as it were, melting, burning, being done away with, and a complete new heaven and a new earth, because the old has passed away. I was rereading the Revelation in preparation for this, and there's a very definite passing away of the old. Mm-hmm. I think actually Berkov in his systematic theology is very careful on this, much more careful. And he presents, there is in the scripture there is a renewal, but you cannot get away from the destruction of this earth, which is under judgment and will pass away.
How do you read 2 Peter 3?
Well, I mean, this was brought up with me and then commented on publicly. I wasn't aware it was going to be publicly commented on. I had a private conversation, and that was then pushed out in public, which I think is unfortunate. And the person interacting with me said, well, of course, 2 Peter 3 is apocalyptic literature, and therefore you can't read it literally. Well, first of all, I want to say... when you look at 2 Peter 3, it's not absolutely definite that Peter is writing apocalyptically at that point. But let's take the apocalyptic line on its own terms. Mm-hmm. So if you go to 2 Peter chapter 3, if he is talking apocalyptically, and he talks about the elements burning and melting, even in apocalyptic literature, where you have these apocalyptic scenes, though... the imagery is apocalyptic, they are speaking about reality. So, for example, if you take it out of 2 Peter 3 and you look at Sodom, or you look at actually Jerusalem and how it's going to be completely erased, they were completely erased. So, you have apocalyptic language being used, but that doesn't mean it isn't referring to something that is actually going to happen.
Yeah.
I think Tim follows an article actually by Jonathan Moo, who argues very strongly that 2 Peter 3 is about a revealing, a showing, and therefore a revealing of our works rather than a destruction. But you've
the language does seem to me to be about destruction. I mean, I've got it open in front of me here, and
right.
The heavens will pass away, loud noise. The elements will burn and be dissolved. The earth and its works, and it will be disclosed.
Yes,
but
yes. So you go back and you have a look at the day of the day of the Lord will come like a thief, and then the heavens will pass away with a roar. And the heavenly bodies will be burned up, and you look up that word kauso, and you'll see it. It is burned up.
Yeah.
And then you look later on when he talks about the heavens will be set on fire and dissolved. The language is of fire. Now, the reason I stress the apocalyptic language is, even if it's being taken apocalyptically, and it may or may not be in here. I don't want to necessarily seed that ground, but even if it is, apocalyptic language refers to a reality.
Yeah.
And you look at Sodom, you look at the flood, you look at Jerusalem, you could look at Babylon. They were erased, obliterated, and destroyed.
Yeah.
And I think that's immensely important. Otherwise, you say, oh, well, there's a flood, and this world was just washed, and out of the washed world came effectively the same thing again. And that's the sort of language that is used, and therefore there's going to be a renewal of everything that we have, and the building you build will be brought through into the new creation, but somehow better. And I'm afraid I just don't see that, and I don't think it's controversial, because I think the Bible's very clear on that. And what's happened is more recently, a lot of evangelicals have just overstressed the renewal and underplayed the destruction, and then found a level of meaning in work in this perishing world that simply is illegitimate.
That my work as a something will continue into the new heavens and the new earth.
And more often than not, it's kind of middle class stuff. So, I worked for somebody once in church work who talked about the music of Wagner being in the new creation, but not Wagner himself. Now, I hope the music will be a lot better, but it's never thrash metal.
Right. There's a snobbishness about that.
I think there's a tremendous Greek snobbishness about it. That's right, and it's always it works with the lawyer. You never hear somebody, I think the garbage collector's work will be in the new creation. And as they say in the city where I work, we're insurance. We have the centre of the world's insurance market. We're insurance workers. Insurance in the new creation.
That's right. What do they do?
Yeah, well, exactly.
What's that look like in the perfect world?
Could be a bit tricky. So that is to trivialise a very, very important issue, because if I start investing the kind of meaning in my day-to-day work, now we mustn't then swing the other way and say that my day-to-day work is completely futile. I mean, that in a sense, we can talk about this in a moment. If we go back to Genesis, there is a futility to it, but there's real dignity in work and a real responsibility in work as I seek to love my neighbour, feed my family, and there's a real. God is a worker. Jesus worked with his hands. The Apostle Paul worked. So, there is a dignity in it.
Yeah, how do you? I'm just imagining conversation after conversation with senior executive for you as you lead a Bible study group over Wednesday breakfast or something like that. As people in the church want to disagree with you because they are seeing part of their identity and their raison d'etre for life in being a banker. Do you know?
Yeah, I think there are several responses. Number one, at St Helen's Church, we have a lot of people who are not senior executives.
Right.
So, we actually have groups for illiterate people. We have a couple of Bible study groups where people cannot read. So that's a caricature which just is helpful.
So it's not everybody who's a senior executive.
A couple of senior executives. And everybody else is engaged in whatever work they happen to be doing right the way across the spectrum. So, it's not, though we are in the CBD, it's not quite as people imagine. But I think it's profoundly liberating, actually, when I begin to realize what Genesis, for example, has to say about my day-to-day work, and then having understood that rightly, to lift and see, actually, as the Lord Jesus, I have food that you know nothing about, and I am laboring to do my Father's, and don't work for food that perishes. So I think you suddenly realize, actually, I've got a whole new work that I wasn't thinking about. I think it's a spiritual revolution, hence revolutionary work in a person's life, to say, actually, yes, I am to do my day job, working as unto the Lord. I've got a new master. I've got a reward for, doing it not according to eye service, as it were, but it really doing it honestly with integrity. Yeah, but there's a whole different level of work, a different order of work going on in the workplace. And that order of work is the proclamation of the gospel. And in a sense, I've been put there as a missionary. So it always strikes me as bizarre that, we're sending missionaries out all over the world and the country, but somebody might not realize that we are missionaries in our workplace, and the Lord has sent us into the workplace to proclaim the gospel. I think that lifts the whole experience of work for people. Very liberating.
Let's go to Genesis, and what are you saying positively is taught about work in the early chapters, and then the frustration that comes?
Yes, thank you. It's a very, very good question. I think we have got to teach work through the lens of Genesis 1 to 4. If you look at Genesis chapter 1, you will see that God blessed them, be fruitful and fill the earth and subdue it. There is a dignity. God is a worker. We're made in his image. He works. Jesus works. The Apostle Paul works, and so forth. So there is a real dignity. There's a responsibility to work. We're to fill the earth and subdue it. The Apostle Paul, he who will not work shall not eat. So there's a responsibility to feed myself and my family. And you remember in Ephesians where Paul says, let the thief, start working with his hands, so he's got something to share. So I think Martin Luther talks about loving your neighbour, and the part of your work is loving our neighbour. So there is that whole work is good. But Genesis is Moses. When he writes Genesis, obviously he doesn't have the chapter headings and the verse numbers that we have. And as you know, Genesis chapter 2, verse 4, these are the generations of. And then Genesis chapter 5, verse 1, these are the generations of. And that phrase, running right the way through Genesis, shows how the material is ordered. Now, that means Genesis 2 through Genesis 5, 1 is ordered as a block of material. When we do the study of the text, the center point of that block is the fall. And following the fall, everything changes. And that then describes the world in which we currently find ourselves. And Genesis chapter 3, to Adam he said, because you've listened to the voice of your wife, and eaten of the tree of which I command you shall not eat of it, cursed is the ground because of you. And from that point, in pain you shall eat of it, thorns and thistles it shall bring forth, and by the sweat of your face you shall eat bread till you return to the ground, for you were taken from the dust, and to dust you shall return. So there you see that God has actually cursed the whole business of work in this world. Yes, there remains a dignity, and again, we mustn't kind of swing too far one way. Yes, there remains a dignity. Yes, there remains a responsibility in work. But actually the work that perishes, if you like, the work of this world, God has cursed that work, and there's a futility, there's a pain. Now, when you say that to people, I've spoken to guys who've been working on some sort of digital program for their company. They've been working on it for like 18 months. And then suddenly there's a glitch in the system and the whole thing is scrambled. Or a new boss arrives and says, well, we're on to something different now. Or, I remember in the GFC, in the big global financial crisis, one guy saying, I have worked all my life in this bank. I've been warning about this and done a good job. And now the bank, because of the way other people have worked, has had all its profit wiped out. And that is, in the world I grew up in, farming, thorns grow literally. You cut the weed this year and you think you're done with it, and next year it's straight back up again. And then at the end of it, the vice chairman, I'm trying not to use these high-flying executives you talk about because there are bags of other people around. But, very early on in my time at St Helens, a guy who'd been vice chairman of Lloyd's took me round the Lloyd's building, took me to the very top of the Lloyd's building where they have the Lutchin's bell that they ring when a big ship goes down.
Right.
They've got the Titanic stuff there as well. It's an extraordinary room. He'd been vice chairman of Lloyd's. He'd helped sort Lloyd's out when Lloyd's had its big crisis. We came back down, and when we stood at the bottom of the escalator at the end of this wonderful tour, he just said to me, do you know, 5 years ago I was vice chairman. As I was going up the escalator, everybody went, Colin, hi, good to see you, Colin. How are you, Colin? Oh, wonderful, how are you doing? And we'd been up and down, and virtually nobody had greeted him. And so this is the experience again and again. I sometimes say to the guys in the city, when you finish your work in the city, how long do you think they'll remember you? The waters close over, you're forgotten, and probably before you're forgotten, people are saying, do you remember that bloke? What a complete idiot he was.
Yeah.
So I think it just helps us understand our work in this one. I could talk about this, much longer than we've
as
got.
you say that, I think about my role before Christian ministry in broadcasting, and you broadcast something on the radio and it's gone immediately. In fact, we were taught if we'd made a mistake on the air, not to apologise 10 minutes later when you worked out you made a mistake 10 minutes ago, because it's a whole different audience.
It'll all be forgotten. Yeah.
All forgotten.
Yes, it is. And in the book, I talk about growing up at work, because a lot of people on the kind of more senior end have had the wonderful privilege and unique privilege of actually being able to enjoy their work. Now, a lot of people, I think farmers, often enjoy their work. All sorts of people enjoy their work, but they've had like 40, they're around about 45. And then they'll come to me and suddenly say, I'm not sure what I'm meant to be doing. My life feels this, that, and the other. And I will, when I'm not needing to be a little more gentle, I might say something like, well done. That's what most people realise when they're 17. They've had a job now for a year. They've been doing exactly the same thing on the production line, day in, day out. And that's why they go out on a Friday night and get absolutely blasted.
Yeah.
Because, but actually if some people find wonderfully great enjoyment in the work, praise God for that. Work is good. Dignity, responsibility in work. That's wonderful. But actually, it is pretty repetitive.
Yeah. In radio news, I worked out, at one level, there we are in the newsroom doing close to power, close to the most exciting thing that's going on. Knowing prime ministers' names, people ringing you back, seeing leadership tussles up close, being there, seeing firsthand the things that are on the front page of the newspaper, and yet in the end, it's just a fire in a different building in a different suburb, or it's just a horse race in a different that is won by a different jockey, or it's just a football game that's won by, and so most news stories just go round on a cycle again, and then so. People ask me, do I miss radio? And most days I say no, and then just occasionally there's a day like that January the 6th when democracy hung in the balance, you think, that's an interesting day. That's a history-making day.
But even that will get swept away.
And forgotten.
And I think that's why, it comes from bad exegesis. So, the concerns about 1 Corinthians 15 arose out of bad exegesis. So, this in 1 Corinthians 15:58, Paul says, the work of the Lord is not in vain. And somebody said to me, oh, well, the same word vain is the word that is used at the beginning of the chapter, vain. Yeah, but that word vain, used at the beginning of the chapter, is used in the same breath as futility for your faith, and in a chapter which talks about this body and all we're doing perishing, being dishonourable, and being mortal. And so, you can make a case for kind of my reporting or my bank deal being really important. But actually, that's bad exegesis of 1 Corinthians 15. And it's not, ironically, one of the things they stress most strongly in the student conferences is context, context, context. And the concerns arose from not taking the context sufficiently seriously, which, I thought was quite surprising. But,
So what does remain?
Well, the gospel remains. Gospel work remains. And, I share the gospel with somebody at work. They come to the Lord. They stand. And godliness remains. My living a godly life and pleasing the Lord is rewarded. Precisely what work I do, we labour over thinking, going to career consultants and all the rest of it, am I doing the right sort of work? That's a privilege of the elite.
My grandfather, working in a coal mine, he never asked the question of, does this bring job satisfaction in a Lancashire coal
Mr.
mine?
Collins, Jim Collins, who lived on the next door farm to us, he would spend, that's what his father did, he farmed. And he would spend 3 weeks hoeing turnips in the summer heat, and I would do half an hour and think I'd had enough of it. So the privilege of asking what I end up doing is, it's significant, but it's of minimal significance. How I do it, that really matters, because I'm doing it as unto the Lord. And as I do it unto the Lord with my eye on him, Ephesians 6, not on the boss, as it were, to please him, and then my godliness and integrity, that remains. So godliness remains, and people remain, which is why I say, I think to describe it in terms of 2 orders of work. There's the work of the Lord, and then there's the work we do in this broken creation. And my concern is that as a result of kind of technically neo-Calvinistic teaching, what has happened is there's been a significant imbalance. And that then knocks, not only does it, I think, damage every Christian because we misunderstand our work and place the wrong kind of emphasis on it, and then when Genesis 3 comes along, we get completely befuddled. But it also it diminishes the importance of what you would call gospel work, the proclamation of the gospel, and you see people thinking, oh well, I'd much rather go off and be the top level accountant or the best road sweeper in the world rather than proclaiming the gospel.
Easier.
I think, yes, I think that's right, and less valuable. And I think that is so. There's been some discussion in the UK over less people coming forward for Bible teaching work, and there's been a certain amount of analysis, and there are many, many reasons. But I think the reason in my mind, and the thing I've seen most significant, is a blurring of the distinctions between the work of the Lord and the work that we do, to feed our face, as it were, to put food on the table and so forth. Now, the work we do to put food on the table, don't get me wrong, it is dignified and it's important that we do it Christianly. But the work of the Lord is of a different order. And if I realise that is my job. It used to upset me in the army when I was serving as a soldier. that people would, talk as if I wasn't in full-time Christian work. And I always understood myself to be there to do the work of the Lord.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, of course, I had the job to do, training soldiers and all the rest of it. But my real reason for being there was to make Jesus known. That's the work that's going to last, and that's what really counts.
Thanks so much for coming in. William Taylor has been my guest on The Pastor's Heart. He is the author of this book, Revolutionary Work, What is the Point of the 9 to 5? He's the Senior Minister of St Helens in London, and my name's Dominic Steele. We will look forward to your company on The Pastor's Heart next Tuesday afternoon.